Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Kim Johnson. I am the Senior Policy Director with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and this is the Advancing Homelessness Solutions webinar, the next in a series of webinars that we are doing with our colleagues at the National Alliance to End Homelessness and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Thank you all again for being here. We are going to be going over some of the president's budget request, the top line, the top line summary of that request, as well as diving into some of the details around homelessness assistance grants and rental assistance. We're also going to be talking about ways for advocates to get involved, answering your questions and providing additional resources so that everyone can feel confident in taking action to defend these vital programs. So without further ado, let's jump on in and get started. That's me, Kim Johnson, Senior Director of Policy with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. So I wanted to start off with a quick overview of what the president's partial budget request entails, and also do just a little bit of level setting, table setting for folks who might not be super familiar with the federal appropriations process. So first, what exactly is a partial budget? You may have heard of a partial budget referred to as a skinny budget as well, but a partial budget request acts as a preview to the president's full budget request. The president has to release a budget request every year in advance of the upcoming fiscal year appropriations cycle. So this is not anything new or unexpected. The partial budget essentially gives the White House more time to draft the full text for their full budget proposal, while also giving Congress the information that it needs to begin the appropriations process and start those kind of top-line negotiations. The president's full budget request is expected to be out sometime in the coming weeks, and so we will have additional details to share after we have that out. And so one thing I want folks to keep in mind as we have this conversation, in part because a lot of the numbers we're going to be talking about are going to sound very, very bleak. But I think it's very important for folks to keep in mind that the president's budget request, whether partial or not, represents the president and his administration's priorities. So it is a wish list and not a reality or an inevitability. We have power to fight back against preposterous proposals, and we have a responsibility to do so, given how much potential harm this budget could enact if it were to come into law. So this partial budget request that we saw at the beginning of the month, May 2nd, includes cutting $26.7 billion, or about 43% from HUD's rental assistance program, and in fact, redesigning the rental assistance program entirely, which my colleague Sonia Acosta is going to be talking about a little bit later. Overall, the partial budget request would slash HUD funding by about 44%. It would also decrease homelessness assistance grants by about 13% from the previous year, and it would fold in or consolidate the Continuum of Care program and the Housing Opportunities for People with AIDS, or HOPWA program, under this broader Emergency Solutions Grants program. And my colleague Steve Berg at the National Alliance to End Homelessness is going to be hopping on after my overview to provide more details on that. I know there are a lot of questions on that. We already have one in the chat. This proposal would also impose a 2-year time limit on receiving rental or homelessness assistance, and it cuts major funding from other vital programs, including Native housing programs, and consolidating under multiple programs under one broader block grant. It would also cut funding for the lead hazard reduction and healthy homes programs. And it would fully eliminate several programs that communities rely on, either for the development and operation of affordable housing or for other important services and community development programs. So again, to emphasize as we continue this conversation that this request represents the president and his administration's priorities and is a wish list, not an inevitability. What we're expecting next is the president's full budget request to come out in the coming weeks. After that, the leaders of the House and Senate Appropriations Committees are going to need to negotiate to come up with a top line funding number known as a 302A allocation which will cover all of FY25 funding, and a top-line funding number for each of the 12 annual appropriations bills, including the one that funds HUD programs. Those are also known as 302B agreements. Once those agreements are reached, the House and Senate appropriators will draft, debate, and pass their own bills for FY26 and then have to reconcile the differences between those two bills with a final FY26 budget due by October 1st, which is the beginning of the FY26 appropriations year. So a lot on Congress's plate to negotiate before that October 1st deadline. Now, without further ado, let's talk a little bit about what we can do in order to ensure that these harmful provisions that we're about to discuss don't get enacted into law. I think it's important to point out that advocates have the power to stop and block and delay and mitigate harm. We have power to make sure that these proposals do not come to fruition. Equally as important, we also have the power and the opportunity to continue laying the groundwork for future advances for the big picture policies that we know solve homelessness and provide people experiencing homelessness with the shelter and services they need for long-term housing stability. So now, without further ado, I'm delighted to turn it over to my colleague, Steve Berg, who is the Chief Policy Officer with the National Alliance to End Homelessness and is going to be covering some of those details for the Homeless Assistance Grants request. Steve, thanks so much for joining.
All right, thanks, Kim, and thanks everybody for joining the show today. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about homelessness funding and the specific homelessness programs. And just for a review of people who aren't familiar with this, these are in the appropriations bill, in the spending bill that covers HUD programs. This is in the account known as the Homeless Assistance Grants. So that consists of funding for the Continuum of Care program, funding for the Emergency Solutions Grants Block Grant program, and then some other items that give HUD specific money to do technical assistance and things like that. So what those programs do is they do these three things that are listed down on the bullets. They spend a lot of the money goes for people who used to be homeless and aren't homeless anymore, but have been moved into housing paid for by the Continuum of Care program. And if they want to stay housed, they need to keep paying the rent. So a lot of the money is for that. It provides money for shelters, for outreach to people who are homeless on the streets, for rapid rehousing kinds of programs to move people quickly back into housing. Those are the kinds of services that are provided. In fiscal year 25, now we're talking about the fiscal year 26 spending bills. Fiscal 25 bills were already done, and they provided no increase in funding compared to the year before, compared to fiscal 24. And that's, as I said, it's a reduction in capacity because, as I said, a lot of the money goes to pay rent for people who aren't homeless anymore, and rents go up every year. They certainly went up last year. So just leaving the funding level at the same level as the fiscal 25 bill did means fewer people can be housed. Okay, next slide, please. So before I get into the administration's budget, let me talk about what's needed. This is our calculation is 4.922 billion is what's needed in fiscal year 2026. That's a fairly large increase over 25 and 24. And remember, there was no increase in 25, so the numbers in 24 and 25 are the same. So a lot of that is to make up for the fact that rents have been going up. As I said before, rents have been going up. A lot of the Continuum of Care program pays for keeping people housed who have already been housed, who used to be homeless. And we want to make sure they don't become homeless again. This 4.922 would also include a substantial increase in the emergency solutions grants. As I said, the ESG program is a program that's been funded at $290 million a year for as long as I can remember. It's supposed to cover shelter, it's emergency shelter, and other kinds of outreach to people on the street. And we're seeing an increase in street homelessness, in unsheltered homelessness. A lot of that is because communities need more money for shelter, and this is the federal program that's supposed to support that, and it just hasn't gotten an increase in years. And then the 4.922 also includes 150 million for new continuum of care projects. That would be targeted, under our proposal, would be targeted the way the community chooses to target them. And then besides the money, there's a couple of positive policy changes. People know we went to a 2-year NOFO. People who work on the continuum of care know that it went to a 2-year NOFO, which means a lot less work for people on the ground who are putting the applications together. More money for increased technical assistance, a lot of which was really cut back with the new administration. And we want to make sure there's funding to do that. Okay, next slide, please. So let's talk about the president's proposals a little bit. And again, this is in the context where the fiscal 25 bill made no increases in this account, which means that due to rising rents and rising operating costs, that has damaged the capacity of these programs to do what they need to do. The president's budget proposal, as Kim said, includes a 12% cut in the homelessness programs. It consolidates, with the quotation marks. It basically moves these competitive grant programs like the COC and the Hopper program into the ESG block grant. ESG is a block grant now. It just gives a set amount to state and local governments to do a range of things with the range of things that are provided with that. A lot of it is up to the local government, but it covers shelters, it covers rapid rehousing, it covers outreach to people who are living on the street. The block granting at a much lower funding level, we're concerned about that because we're more than concerned. We're deeply opposed to that, partly because it would take away a lot of the accountability that the more competitive continuum of care program makes. And another reason is right now, permanent housing is not an allowable activity under the ESG program. So if all the money was moved into the ESG program, there would be no money to continue the permanent housing that the continuum of care pays for now. So as I said, there will be more on that later. Next slide, please. So there we go. New developments on this. People who have been following this know that we were circulating Dear Colleague letters asking members of Congress to sign on to a letter to the appropriators asking for these big increases I don't know if they're big increases or not, but the increases that we were asking for. Those letters recently closed. People who worked on that in the field, who called their members of Congress asking them to sign on to this letter, did a great job. Those letters just closed. We don't have the final count on how many senators and representatives signed on to those letters, but it was a really good turnout, and that sends a strong message to the Appropriations Committee that this is a priority for a lot of members of Congress. Besides signing on to the letter, members can contact the THUD Appropriations Subcommittee directly and ask for increases in these proposals. So even though it's too late to ask your member of Congress to sign onto the letter, they can go on the portal until Friday close of business and make a direct request themselves. So we'll talk about that a little bit in a minute too. Next slide, please. There we go. So these are the things that we'd like people to do, that people can do to be really helpful right now. One is find out if your members signed on to those Dear Colleague letters. Those are the emails. We don't have the final list yet of who signed the letters, but you can email either John or Samantha at our office, and they will be able to tell you whether your member of Congress signed on to them. And then thank them. The members of Congress don't get thanked enough, so we try to do that when we can. As I said, they can go to the THUD Appropriations Committee's portal. They call it a portal. It's like a website that members of Congress can log on to and make requests to the Appropriations Committee. That portal for THUD is open till Friday, close of business, as I said. It's a good thing to ask Republicans to do because Republican members don't really sign on to the Dear Colleague letters very often at all. And if you are represented by a Democrat who didn't sign on to those letters, they can make a direct request to the Appropriations Subcommittee by Friday, end of the day. And then there's also another Dear Colleague that's still open until the end of the day tomorrow on the Emergency Housing Vouchers Program. And Sonia is going to talk about that in detail in a minute, but that's another thing just for people to keep in mind that they can do. Okay, next slide. Okay, that's it for me. Do you want to, do we have a minute for a couple of quick questions before we move on to Sonia?
Yeah, I think we have a minute for a couple questions, specifically on the COC piece. And thank you again so much, Steve, for joining today and sharing your expertise. And just so folks know, we're also going to circle back for a longer Q&A at the end of Sonia's section. So if we don't answer your question right now, we'll circle back to it. But Steve, a lot of great questions about kind of the implication of folding these homelessness programs under the ESG program. So one, basically, what would the impact of that move be on rural communities who aren't currently ESG block grant recipients?
Well, I think that's one of the many problems with this. I mean, I think HUD in recent years in the Continuum of Care program has made various attempts to try to get more of the continuum of care funding out to rural areas. People may have different opinions if you're from a rural area about how well that's worked, but it's better. It works better than it did like 10 years ago. But the ESG rural areas have to completely rely on the state government because they'll be deciding who gets what from the ESG block grant, and I just hear from a number of people who are working in rural communities that is not going to, that's going to make it very difficult for them to get funding they need to run programs for people who are homeless.
Thanks, Steve. And a related question too that I think you just touched on from Khan. If COCs are dissolved, what does that mean for decision making? Would deciding where to send funds for homelessness services go to state governments instead?
Yeah, it'd be up to whoever is getting the block grant in your community. And as I said, with the formula, the formula now for ESG is that some of it goes to states and some of it goes to larger cities and counties, the larger by population. Now, the president's preliminary budget said something about changing the formula for the ESG program, but there's no information at all we've been able to get from anywhere about what they have in mind. So nobody can be very sure about what level of funding they would get from this request. It's just the other thing I would just say. Usually, when there are major structural changes in programs, and this would be a major structural change, it usually takes several years of the administration and Congress working together to with states and with local communities to figure out how to run this program in a different way, in a way that wouldn't cause all kinds of problems. And the administration is not proposing anything like that. They're proposing to just sort of ram this down people's throats, I would say. And I feel like we have a good chance of convincing Congress, even members of Congress who are pretty supportive of the administration in general, that this is not a good idea, but we're going to have to work at it.
Definitely. Thank you, Steve. And there's another question around talking points that I think we'll come back to after Sonia's presentation. But one more question for you. Can you talk a little bit more about what you're referring to when you talk about the competitiveness of a block grant or a competitive block grant program?
Well, so the continuum of care program is a competitive program in that communities apply to HUD and they get a score based on, some of it is based on how many renewals they have to fund, how many existing programs they have that they have to fund, but some of it is based on how good a job they're doing, how many people are moving from homelessness into housing, whether they're adopting best practices, known best practices, whether they're using uh, research-based solutions. Um, with a block grant, there would still be competition, but it wouldn't be based on those things. It wouldn't be a competition with HUD based on those sort of well thought out things. It would be a competition with the local government that's getting the block grant about who they're going to fund with it. Um, and there are some communities that would do just fine with that. Whether they're going to have the money, I mean, they're going to have a lot less money. The administration proposed a block grant for a lot less money than the continuum of care has now. Um, so everybody's going to have to deal with that. But then there's other communities where you have to ask yourself, would I want my local members of the city council or local county commissioners or the state agency, would I want them making decisions about what people who are homeless and programs that are homeless need in my community? And you know, just from going around the country and talking to a lot of people, I would say the answer is no to that question for a lot of places. And that's something I hope people will make sure that their members of Congress understand.
Definitely. Thank you, Steve. We have a few other questions, but we'll circle back to those at the end of the call during our Q&A portion. But now I would like to welcome my colleague Sonia Acosta, Senior Policy Analyst at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, to provide an overview of the Housing Choice Voucher and State Rental Assistance Block Grant Program proposed in the President's preliminary budget. So Sonia, please take it away. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Kim, and hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today's call. You can just go to the next slide. So just to get us started, I want to talk a little bit about where we stand right now in terms of funding. So as has been mentioned, we are under a continuing resolution right now, which means that funding levels were largely kept flat from fiscal year 2024 levels. There were some changes to various programs. Those are referred to as anomalies. So I've just listed a few here to show that there were increases for federal rental assistance programs, primarily for the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And that was specifically for renewing existing vouchers that didn't go to administrative funds, but just to Housing Choice Vouchers. It didn't even go to increasing funding for Section 811 mainstream vouchers. So even with some of these increases, though, that we saw in the continuing resolution, we have been hearing that some agencies are still short on funding for this year. So there was a story recently about the Housing Authority in Cook County in Illinois. Been hearing from folks in California that some of those agencies are short on funding. And so what that means is that those agencies then have to take cost-cutting measures, which can lead to fewer households receiving assistance or even making the program potentially less effective. So some examples of that look like agencies not reissuing vouchers when a family leaves the program for some reason. It could mean changing how much they pay in terms of a subsidy. There are some other ways that agencies can kind of save money that don't take assistance away. But in the long term, what it means is fewer people are receiving assistance, and it's going to make things a lot tighter generally in terms of funding. And because rents have been really high, and that means that program costs in the voucher program have been really high, a lot of agencies don't have reserve funding to kind of fall back on to help when funding from Congress isn't sufficient to kind of keep assistance where it should be. So we go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about what 2026 could look like. So that's just kind of setting the context of where we are now, because we're already in a bit of a tight funding spot for vouchers, similar to what Steve was talking about with homeless assistance grants. And Trump's partial budget proposal would take us even farther away from where we need to go and would result in millions of people losing assistance, facing eviction, and potentially homelessness. So one of the big proposals around rental assistance is to combine several different federal rental assistance programs into a single block grant that would then go to states. And so those rental assistance programs are the Housing Choice Voucher Program, Section 8 project-based rental assistance, public housing, Section 202 housing for the elderly, and Section 811 supportive housing for persons with disabilities. So among those 5 programs, that's about 10 million people who are receiving federal rental assistance. So it would take all of that, make it into a more flexible block grant, and then cut funding by 43%. So cut funding nearly in half, which would certainly result in millions of people losing assistance. And this is assistance they desperately need just to afford a stable home. The other proposal that was in the partial budget that there's not a lot of details about is to implement a 2-year time limit for households receiving federal rental assistance. This would likely exclude older adults and some persons with disabilities, but again, we don't have the details and knowing kind of how that would be determined. But the real issue with this policy is that it would, again, take assistance away from people and really ignores the reality of low wages and high rents. National Low Income Housing Coalition does their out of reach report every year, and it really shows kind of that folks have to work multiple jobs just to afford a 1 or 2 bedroom home. And we know that 14 of the nation's 20 most common occupations pay median wages that are less than what is needed for a full-time worker to afford just a modest home. And so implementing a 2-year time limit in the hopes that somehow someone is able to earn wages that are enough to really afford a home is really unrealistic, because these are structural issues that we're talking about, where wages are just too low and rents are too high. And so it's going to punish people and take that assistance away from them. We can go to the next slide. Just to kind of circle back on the block grant piece of this proposal, block granting overall just really sets us up for future cuts. So here in this chart, it shows that funding for major housing, health, and human services block grant programs has fallen significantly over the past few decades, particularly when you consider population growth, which is the red line, And when you compare it to kind of our country's gross domestic product, which is the yellow line at the bottom, right? So when you look at that, what we're providing as a country to these block grant programs is going drastically down, helping fewer people, becoming less effective. And so block granting the programs that we have now is just setting up for future harm. It also really just shifts the burden to states, because if the block grant is going to states, they're going to be the ones who are responsible for deciding how to implement those cuts. It takes away some of the responsibility of Congress to kind of own up to cutting those funds, and really puts the burden on the states, not only to make those decisions, but also to try to fill in any gaps. The partial budget mentioned something about cost sharing, states cost sharing with the federal government for some of these new proposed block grants. But given the major cuts that the partial budget also proposes, any money that states could afford to put towards these programs, any cost sharing, would really just be trying to offset those cuts. And even in this partial budget, as Kim mentioned, the administration proposed just completely eliminating or drastically cutting all of the housing block grants. So again, the idea of block granting federal rental assistance programs is just a big red flag in terms of what could happen in the future. We can go to the next slide. So those were some of the proposals from the Trump administration. But one additional thing to consider for fiscal year 2026 that is, again, kind of putting some pressure on this budget, is that there are additional resources needed to ensure that people with emergency housing vouchers don't lose assistance. So the Emergency Housing Voucher Program was created in 2021, and it received a fixed amount of funding at $5 billion. These vouchers are targeted to people at risk of or experiencing homelessness and survivors of domestic violence, trafficking, and other gender-based violence. This funding, the $5 billion, is projected to run out midway through next year. And for some agencies, they're expecting that the funding may run out even sooner, potentially at the end of this year. And the reason that this money is kind of running out sooner than many agencies anticipated is because we saw some really rapid rent increases, particularly in 2021 and 2022. But between 2020 and 2024, rents increased about 30%, right? And that is unprecedented. And so the resources that were allocated in 2021 just went really quickly. And now we are facing this funding cliff, even though there's still more than 59,000 households who are relying on emergency housing vouchers to pay the rent each month. And like I kind of talked about earlier, many housing agencies who administer these programs are already tight on funding. And so they and other community partners really lack the resources to easily transition these households to other programs. And even in places where they might have resources, it's going to mean very likely that someone else in need does not get that resource, right? If they're able to transition someone from an emergency housing voucher to the kind of standard housing choice voucher program, that means that someone who's on the waiting list, who's likely been waiting years and years for assistance, is going to have to continue to wait longer. So what we're really asking Congress to do is to provide funding to continue these vouchers to make sure that these households don't lose assistance, and to move us closer to addressing homelessness and making sure that everyone has the assistance that they need. So if we can go to the next slide. Again, when we're talking about emergency housing vouchers, it's just really important to lift up the stories of who these people are, and kind of the impact that it will have on folks in the community. We'll share some resources in the next few slides, but there is some kind of data limitations in terms of knowing who these households are. We can tell you how many emergency housing vouchers are in your community, but we can't tell you much more. And so we're really encouraging folks in their communities to find out who these people are and lift up their stories. I've included a few stories that I've been able to find, just to give you an idea of kind of what to talk about, and to help everyone kind of understand who these people are and the vulnerabilities that they face if they lose assistance. We can go to the next slide. So just to sum up some of these asks to make to Congress. So first is fully funding housing choice vouchers. And this year, that includes ensuring that no one with emergency housing vouchers loses assistance. The second is to reject the proposal to block grant rental assistance. Again, that's just going to set us up for additional cuts. The third is to exclude any policies that take away assistance from people. So that includes the time limit that we saw in the partial budget, but also includes any proposals around work requirements. We saw last week an op-ed from several secretaries in the administration calling for work requirements, supporting them. But we know that they don't really achieve the goal of helping connect people to work. And what they really end up doing is just taking assistance away from people. And then the kind of final voucher funding ask that is incredibly important is just looking forward. What we really need is a rental assistance guarantee. It's a proven tool. The remaining need is incredibly high in communities across the country. There's no place that has enough rental assistance for people who need it. And improvements absolutely can be made to this program, but the improvements that need to be made are not ones that are going to deny people assistance, like time limits or work requirements. So if I can go to the next slide. In terms of taking action, again, kind of thinking of those asks from the last slide, just urging Congress to provide full funding for housing choice vouchers, including emergency housing vouchers. And our three organizations, plus the National Housing Law Project, have put together a toolkit to make this a lot easier. It has template language, a link to take action and contact your member of Congress. And again, just want to lift up and ask that Steve mentioned earlier in terms of a Dear Colleague letter specific to emergency housing vouchers. We would really encourage folks to reach out to their members and encourage them to sign on if they haven't already. Our toolkit has like a template email that you can just take, fill in a few things, and send off to your members of Congress asking them to take action. And the deadline for that is 5 p.m. Eastern time tomorrow, May 22nd. And then kind of the last piece is to make sure that you are working with your state and local officials and agencies to mitigate harm of potential funding losses. We know that this is going to be a really challenging time to get funding from Congress. They are currently working on a separate bill to cut funding for Medicaid and for food assistance and many other incredibly important programs. So we know this is going to be difficult, and it'll be really important for folks in their local communities to think about ways that they can mitigate harm, particularly around emergency housing vouchers. Are there resources that folks can tap into to make sure that these households who have spent the last few years really kind of building their lives kind of don't lose that stability? That's so incredibly helpful. But that is it for me for now. So I'm going to turn it back to Kim to kind of wrap us up and kick off Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you, Sonia, for all of that information. And again, of course, for sharing your time and expertise with us. So like Sonia was saying, and like Steve had emphasized too, we have a lot of advocacy tools and materials and ways for people to get involved in this fight for sufficient funding in FY26. For homeless assistance grants, contact your member offices now and request at least $4.922 billion for the Homeless Assistance Grants Program. Thank them if they have signed the Dear Colleague letter on homeless assistance grants funding. And again, if you would like to see if your member has logged on to that, some of Steve's colleagues at the National Alliance to End Homelessness are keeping that list, and we can drop their emails in the chat again. Encourage your members of Congress to make those homeless assistance grants requests and through the THEAD appropriations portal before 5 p.m. tomorrow. And that is also great if you are represented by a Republican member of Congress or a Democrat who did not sign that dear colleague letter I just mentioned. And ask your members of Congress to sign that emergency housing voucher, dear colleague, by 5 p.m. tomorrow, the 22nd, that Sonia had mentioned as well. We also have that emergency housing voucher toolkit that our colleague Anna has dropped in the chat. So thank you so much, Anna. Please take a look at that for additional suggestions, ideas, and materials and resources. And finally, continue doing the important work that you're doing of working with your state and local officials and agencies as well to help mitigate the harm of potential funding losses. I will say in kind of the big picture advocacy piece too, it's really important to keep in mind that the on-the-ground work that you all are doing is of vital importance, and it is equally as important that your elected officials understand the impact of your programs, the good work that you all are doing. So if you have the opportunity to, invite a member of Congress or your representative to tour a program or a facility that you are working for to highlight and show off the good work that you're doing and the importance of this funding, that is a great way of getting involved. And some additional resources too. Again, we are going to be sending out this link in our follow-up email. So you'll have all of these materials ready and at your disposal. But without further ado, let's jump in for the last 15 minutes to some audience Q&A. And we have a lot of questions that have come in. So let's get started. So a question on available resources. Are there any statistics or information on kind of the cost of experiencing homelessness in terms of kind of the economic impact, the impact on crime in communities, and moreover, any data on how cuts to homeless assistance funding would impact communities' services?
Well, I think there's a lot of information dating back years and years. I mean, it's very well known that homelessness costs communities a lot of money. The healthcare system is one of the big losers when there's more homelessness in a community. The communities spend more, unfortunately, on law enforcement in jails and prisons. The businesses take a hit. So there's many ways in which homelessness costs communities money, and I think the solutions are really, get people housed as quickly as possible, give them the supportive services they need. I mean, many people, people know that people with severe mental illness, for example, are overrepresented among the homelessness population. So it's important that the homelessness programs and the housing programs be working cooperatively together with the healthcare system, particularly the behavioral healthcare system, to make sure that people can get the mental health treatment they need for those who need that, as they're getting rehoused, so that those kind of solutions can be put into place. And you mentioned crime. I think the thing to know about homelessness and crime is that homeless people are a lot more likely to be victims of crime than they are to commit crimes. I mean, there's there are homeless people who commit crimes. There are house people that commit crimes. Way more house people commit crimes than homeless people, but homeless people are very much overrepresented among victims of crime. So that's an important thing for people to know about.
You're muted, Kim.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. Anything you would add to that, Sonia, around the availability of some resources or anything like that?
I don't have anything off the top of my head, but my colleague Anna just dropped some additional resources in the chat for folks that do kind of build off of what Steve said.
Awesome. And I was gonna type it out, but I'm just gonna say it out loud and leave it in the chat. A link to some resources on the efficacy of Housing First and a lot of the homelessness programs that Steve was just discussing. That could be a really good resource for folks who want to learn more as well. So we have a couple questions too about the impact of staffing shortages and staffing cuts on the distribution of HUD funding and the potential impact on, even if we do get full funding in FY26, will that funding be able to reach communities? And so Steve and Sonia, is there anything that you all would want to highlight about how those funding or those staffing cuts at HUD are impacting communities' ability to receive HUD funding right now? Oh, Steve, I think you're muted.
Yeah. Well, I would say there's definitely an impact right now. I mean, the there was a lot of talk about big cuts at HUD, uh, big cuts in federal staffing at HUD. Some of those have taken place, but not. We haven't seen yet anything quite like the level that were supposedly being discussed by people at the White House. So we'll see how that goes. But I think the federal staff are very important on this in terms of making sure that communities have the information they need to do a good job with these funds, um, that that the paperwork gets processed as quickly as possible. Um, so we're when we're talking about what we need for next year, that includes money to fund both the programs at HUD and at the level of the service provider as well.
Yeah, thinking a little bit about you know, staff, how staff help with like the Housing Choice Voucher Program. There are staff at HUD who, right, work really, really closely with housing agencies to help them plan, to help them think about how to wisely use the resources that they have, especially when funding is tight or, less than what they need. You have HUD staff who provide guidance, who provide that technical assistance to help housing agencies make those decisions and limit the harm to people. And without some of those staff, or with fewer staff who are trying to manage way too many things, it means that some of that is not going to happen. And so that leaves housing agencies to make those decisions on their own. It puts people in a more vulnerable position because there isn't kind of that assistance to help think through all of the decision points. For vouchers, getting the funding out is pretty straightforward, fortunately. For a lot of the other HUD programs, it's a lot more of a process, right? You need to kind of draft that NOFO. People need to review it. All of those things need to happen. And without the proper staffing to do that and the proper expertise, right? Because some of it is just losing people who have been there for a really long time and understand the programs, understand the people. And so losing that is a huge loss that can't just be kind of made up with funding, unfortunately, either.
Definitely. And I'll just add to that, we know HUD provides a lot of really important technical assistance to communities, and especially rural communities who often don't have, the funding or the capacity to hire someone to do that technical assistance on, independently. And so HUD also plays that really vital role in providing technical assistance to communities and how to apply for grants, how to utilize those grants, and all of those important pieces too. And without staffing there, communities will not be able to receive the same level of assistance in that way either. We have a couple questions too about recommendations for messaging. So one is, how would you kind of talk about, like, is there a nuance to these issues in talking to, say, conservatives or Republicans? And then the other kind of messaging question, um, I lost. It's somewhere. Um, yeah, so let's start there with what would you recommend saying to conservative or Republican members of Congress on these issues?
Well, there's a couple things, and I think we feel like it's obviously important to not just talk to people who agree with you 100% on these issues, um, because that's not who the majority in Congress is. So I think we talk a lot about the well-being of the community as a whole. The cost to the community is some of the stuff I was talking about before, about how homelessness costs the healthcare system a lot of money. It costs the police system a lot of money. It, it sort of distracts the law enforcement community from doing what it should be doing, which is solving serious crimes, because they have to monitor what's going on with homelessness on the streets. Um, so those are a couple of things. But I think, yeah, the way it affects them, I mean, I think we people work in this field, I think, are mostly people who care a lot about the people who are homeless and on the street. But not everybody, frankly, not everybody who supports what we want, that's not necessarily what they care about. They care about whether the community is safe and whether the community is a good place to live. And I think we can build their support by talking about that.
Yeah, just to build off of that a little bit, right? I think it's really important to lift up stories of people in the community, in the state, in the district. And right, like Steve was saying, really lead from a place of shared values. So if a member is supportive of work requirements because they think it's important for people to work, um, you know, what shared value do you have with them on that? Like, yes, people, we want to make sure that people have access to job opportunities as well. But work requirements don't actually provide that. And then it's kind of turning to some of the research that we have in other programs, showing that work requirements are really ineffective and are mostly just kind of a paperwork burden, right? And people lose assistance because they're unable to kind of fulfill these administrative hurdles. If it's about administrative burden and streamlining things, great. Like there's a lot of ways to do that in all of these programs, and talking about those things, those recommendations versus maybe some that are more harmful and end up cutting assistance can be kind of a way in. So, right, I think it's kind of figuring out what the shared value is in their position and in your position, starting there and moving forward.
Thanks, you all. And so a clarifying question on kind of what to expect next or what advocates should prepare for. Someone in the questions noting, I know FY26 starts on October 1st, but would the FY26 budget impact current contracts or programs? Would it be impacting contracts following new NOFOs that would be going on this summer? Basically, when, if this budget were implemented, would communities have to feel the effects of it? And what would you recommend communities start doing now to prepare for potential cuts or policy changes? I will flag before I hand it over to you all. I think it's important to point out that we shouldn't pre-comply with some of these bananas ideas. And so while it's important, of course, to be prepared and to be thinking forward, the game right now is not necessarily, oh, how do we prepare for these awful cuts, but how do we defend against these awful cuts to make sure that we don't have to prepare for their implementation. But with that being said, I'm going to now turn it over to Sonia and Steve.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Kim. And just kind of on the question of timing. So it does depend on the program. Um, none of this will be kind of real until a final bill passes, which is very unlikely to happen before the beginning of the fiscal year, which is October 1st, 2025, because it's very unlikely that Congress is going to kind of have any sort of final bill. They will likely do a short-term continuing resolution, maybe another continuing resolution, maybe another continuing resolution, unclear. Once some sort of final package is passed, then for programs like rental assistance, that funding shift is pretty immediate, right? It means like, oh, okay, this is the funding level that you will have moving forward, and agencies might need to shift kind of their planning given how much funding they receive. For some of the other programs that rely on like a competitive process, that it will only be impacted once kind of that process gets going. But yeah, Steve, I don't know if you have more to add on that.
Well, yeah, people familiar with the continuum of care know it takes a while to get the money out. So you're still hopefully have fiscal 23 money left over as you're now preparing your contracts for fiscal 24. So the effect of the fiscal 26 budget won't be directly felt for a long time, but it will. Communities know ahead of time sort of what kind of financial straits they'll be in as a result of any of this. I mean, I think overall the message is communities should be prepared to not have as much federal funding this year and next year as you did the few years before. If we end up doing really well and they decide, well, these HUD programs are really important, we've got to preserve them, then great. But when we've seen new administrations and new congressional majorities come in with more conservative viewpoints about the budget, that in years past that it's meant less money. So work with your state and local governments to keep these programs at a level they need to be at, I think is an important point.
Awesome. Well, we have a ton more questions, but unfortunately we are at the 2 o'clock mark. And to be respectful of folks' time, we'll go ahead and close out. Thank you all so much for joining, and thank you, Sonia and Steve, for joining and sharing your expertise and your time with us today. We are going to be holding another Homelessness and Housing First webinar in June. Do either of you happen to remember the date off the top of your head, or Anna?
We're still finding a date, but we hope to host one to dive deeper on emergency housing vouchers, including the impact that they've had on people's communities later in next month.
Awesome. Thank you, Anna. So yes, please keep an eye out for the invitation to our next webinar. And thank you all again for joining. Yeah, until next time, take care, and thank you all for the work that you do.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.